For my first foray into horror, I can definitely say that this was not at all disappointing. Why, hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the Book Binge and another video on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This week, and on this episode, I'm going to be covering Carrie by Stephen King, the debut novel by the master of horror himself. This video is going to be the first in a somewhat long line, or a really long line of Stephen King-oriented reviews that I'm going to be doing as I read his books chronologically. There's so many different places to start with his books, so many different recommendations that people have, and so many varied opinions amongst his fans that I didn't know where to start. So I figured that the easiest way to go would just be to start from the beginning of his releases and then just read through till the end. So that's going to be how I do things. There might be a few exceptions. For example, some of the short story and novella collections may be slightly out of order in terms of their release date, depending on how things go, but I do have a master list of everything that Stephen King has written that I'm going to be going through in a specific order, except for like the Bachman books and, like I said, some of these collections. And actually, right now, this video comes out, I believe, on the 16th of January. I'm just about to start the Gunslinger, the Dark Tower series, so that series is going to be out of the technical publishing order. But basically, everything else is going to occur in chronological release order. So this is the very first one. Just like I said in that very intro, for one of my first technical true forays and kind of dives into horror, I was not at all disappointed by Carrie. So let's kind of get into some of my general non-spoilery thoughts. I knew going in that this book was going to be in a kind of semi-epistolary format, I guess is kind of the way that I'll put it. Some sections of it are kind of written in forms of newspaper articles and book excerpts and stuff like that. Some of it is written in your traditional third story omniscient, and it kind of goes back and forth between that epistolary format and the traditional third person. This is something that I thought worked surprisingly well. I was definitely hesitant about this format because I'm not always into epistolary style writings, except when they're done right. And I think that this one generally does it right. If the entire book was done epistolary and there was none of the third person, it probably would not be that good, all things considered. But the way that Stephen King went back and forth between those things, I think was actually rather cool. I found it very interesting how several of these sections in part 1 and even in part 2, to an extent, actually spoil some of the things about the end, but in such a vague way that it doesn't really matter. Like, they kind of tell you the fates of some of the characters that occur at the end in some of these letters and well, they're not letters, in some of these articles and whatnot that occur in the middle of parts 1 and 2. It's surprising that they give away, or that Stephen King gives away, the fates of some of the characters so early. But because you're so enthralled by the format of the book, you don't really care that it low-key spoils part of the ending, because you want to actually experience it. You want to know what actually happened to cause the fates, because although you know how a couple of the characters end up in the end, you want to know how that happened. And I thought that the way that Stephen King did this through this back and forth format actually worked really well, because it doesn't dismiss any of that intrigue that you have about what's going on. And overall, I think one of the most special things about this kind of format that he does here is the way that it kind of switches back and forth and allows for backstory to be filled out. A lot of the epistolary stuff fills out some of the backstory of Carrie's childhood and some of the other characters' past and some of the past experiences of the town as a whole. And then the third person kind of delves into the here and now and kind of takes those things into consideration and builds upon it. It's something that kind of allows for the whole reading experience to flow rather smoothly, despite the entire writing, the actual writing of the book being slightly disjointed in some ways. And King's prose isn't absolutely perfect in this book. It's not the best, but there are some things about it that just kind of prove how good he is with words. Like, he really knows how to use words. Descriptions and the details in several sections are super good. The dialogue in Carrie is actually very visceral in a way. Like I said, King really knows how to use his words. The way that he organizes them and puts them together makes it feel so surreal to read almost. There are some things that just punch you in the face when you read it, both in dialogue and descriptions. Over the years of wanting to get into Stephen King, I've always heard about how good he is with character work and how well he is with building small towns, and both of these are exemplified in this book, although in a different way than in some others that I've read so far. He does a very good job differentiating these characters. For a debut novel, I was definitely surprised at how unique each of these characters has and how well King writes them. For example, one character has a very particular quirk where he uses the filler a lot. This is something that you don't exactly see in a lot of writing or in Burks, that's not a word, or in a lot of books anymore. It's one of those interesting things that this is a quirk that you can find here that just doesn't appear anymore. You wouldn't go about using the or filler or other stuff like that in dialogue in a book because you want your book to flow smoothly. You want it to kind of go and just move forward the way that it's supposed to. And using a bunch of fillers and stuff, despite feeling very realistic, can oftentimes hinder the quality of the book. But based on some of these quirks, it's only used with this one character, and other characters have their own unique quirks, and it does more good in separating those characters from each other than bad in terms of making it feel like a weird reading experience. And something else that's rather unique about the way that Stephen King wrote in this that I thought was really cool, but also felt was mediocre, was the extremely unique element of parenthetical blurbs that kind of occur in the middle of paragraphs. These parenthetical blurbs are little tiny pieces of thought that occur in different characters' heads, while the descriptions of the third person omniscient fashion goes on. These blurbs are super cool in the sense that they're a great concept. They feel very realistic in a sense because if there were an author like right now describing what I'm doing, there would be some thoughts that are going on in my head that narrator would want to kind of clarify are happening, but the way that most authors do that is by going through their normal writing style in a paragraph, and then they say whatever that person's thinking and include the phrase, this character thought, something like that. King skips that in this specific book and uses these parenthetical blurbs and even interrupts paragraphs and sentences, sometimes even interrupts dialogue with it. I thought this was a really, really cool concept. It's not something I'm a big fan of. I feel like it actually interrupts the flow of the reading a lot in ways that I'm not a big fan of, but generally speaking, it's a cool concept. I'm glad that it's not something that appears in more books because it would get really annoying really fast, as it did in this book. It did get a little bit annoying by the middle of part 2, but I can definitely give King props for trying something different that most other authors wouldn't or even haven't done. So now we get into the section that I want to talk about that's a little bit more spoilery, some of my thoughts about more specific characters and events and whatnot that happen. As I've suggested in the previous section, there's tons of great characterization. King separates his characters really well, and some examples of these are as follows. You really start to feel for Sue Snell because she genuinely comes off as trying to do good for Carrie, and it's a really good way to make you sympathetic for both her and Carrie's character. You really start to love Tommy after a little bit for being legitimately nice and courteous to Carrie. Even if it's just for Sue, his graciousness to Carrie is something that is very, very well done in this book. You just really start to love Tommy because of it. The way that Stephen King uses a lot of religious similes and metaphors while talking in the viewpoint of Carrie, like specifically in Carrie's thoughts and viewpoints, is a hugely satisfying touch to her character. It makes it feel like you're actually in her head following her thoughts, as that's what she's been surrounded with her whole life, is this extremely anally religious perspective from her mother. So the fact that there's a lot of this religious thought process that kind of goes on in her head feels very cool, especially since it's not used from the other characters. It's really good. One of the other nice touches is also how Carrie's mom gets seemingly more psychotic with every scene she's in. Like, you can kind of sympathize with her to an extent in the beginning. Like, you can kind of relate. Like, anybody who's been in a super religious household can almost feel for Carrie and her mom in this sense. Like, you kind of know what they're thinking, you understand why they're that way. But then as the book goes on, King does a really great job of making you understand just how crazy Carrie's mom is. Because while most religious people, even uber religious people, are not this crazy, the way that Carrie's mom is, some are, and it's a very terrifying concept. I'm assuming that King wasn't writing this character in the assumption that all religious people are like this, or in the assumption that all super fanatic religious people are this crazy. If he was, then that's really disappointing. But if he wasn't, it's still fine because, like I said, it's believable in the way that there are actually some people that are that way. There's some people that are that crazy, and it's kind of low-key terrifying, but it works really well for this story. Another great character touch for Carrie herself is that descriptions of some physiological changes that occur in her when she's using her telekinesis. One specific scene would be when she's lifting her hairbrush off her dresser, I believe is what happens. This intense description of the physiological changes that occur in her when she's doing this kind of feel a little bit random at first, but it happens a few times and they're just so visceral that they're almost enjoyable. Like, there's a lot about those scenes that is like, you love to read it because it just feels so specific and it really kind of brings a new life to the book. There are some horrifying scenes as well. Reading through part one of this, I was definitely not of the mind that this is a horror book because there's not a whole lot that happens that's really super crazy in terms of your traditional horror. But the stuff that does happen is really horrific, such as the whole scene with Billy, uh, both going out to get the pig's blood with a couple of his buddies and putting the blood into the rafters. It's like really dreary and creepy, and you just feel uncomfortable reading about it. And following this, when Carrie and Tommy actually go to the dance, there's another section that makes me feel really bad for Carrie because of the way that King uses her dialogue or her internal dialogue. Like, it's super anxious, the way that Carrie feels. She's constantly worried about something bad about to happen, that something's going to happen and everybody's going to laugh at her. Which, fair enough, this is something that she's been dealing with for her entire life. So when this is going on in her head, you really start to feel bad for her more specifically, because there are plenty of things that have already happened in the book up to this point that make you feel bad for Carrie, but this specific scene is really heartbreaking in a way because it's like, well, of course she would be this anxious about going to the dance or being at the dance because her entire life has been people teasing her and bullying her and making fun of her. Of course she's not going to want to be here. And kind of going along with this theme and the way that Carrie is so anxious about the dance, I find it really charming in the way that Tommy is able to convince Carrie to vote for them for the prom king and queen. It's a really good scene, and I actually didn't even realize that the vote was so close in this book. Legitimately, the vote in this book is really close. Like, it is one vote that separates it. So, despite knowing how the outcome would be because of the movie, it was still really anxious reading this section of the book. Like, the anticipation still really killed me. And then this is the big iconic scene when the pig's blood drops on top of Carrie, and the way that King wrote about this was actually masterful. It was really good. So what I mean is, so King actually told this sequence twice, is what he did. The first time he told it was from another student's viewpoint in the gym, and then after that he follows it up with the whole sequence again from Carrie's viewpoint. And I thought this was really good because it provides two very great perspectives, because everyone knows that being Carrie in that situation would be very different than being one of the other students. So to separate those two and actually tell them both, despite feeling a little bit like it's just trying to bloat the book a little bit, it works well, especially since this book isn't long. It's really short, like it's like 65,000 words or something like that. Took me only like 6 hours to read this. So doubling up on certain scenes and sequences from different viewpoints was actually something that worked really well for this book. Plus, additionally, giving us all this extra detail was a really good idea in the first place because it gives us a lot of extra material to chew on, I guess, in the same climatic scene. So, looking at it from one viewpoint, it actually doesn't feel like that much happened. But then when you add Carrie's scene, Carrie's viewpoint after it, her POV, it it brings a lot more life to the sequence. Like there's just so much to think about in it. And the whole sequence that follows with the destruction of the town, absolutely horrifying. If I wasn't fully convinced that this book was horror before like the midpoint of part 2, this whole end sequence definitely does that. For example, the account of Cora Simmond at the end, this is that kind of super long interview that happens in the book. Super amazing. Like it just sold the brutality of the entire event, the brutality of Carrie throughout, her actions and everything that happens. Carrie going home to kill her mom is disgustingly satisfying, if we want to put it that way. You feel guilty for feeling good about it, like you feel like Carrie's mom deserves it, but you also feel like Carrie is being super brutal, but it's just a lot of conflicting emotions that is so perfect. Like I really love this. After that, Carrie going down the street and killing Chris and Billy is super satisfying because they are the reason that this whole thing happened in the first place. Like when it comes to the straw that broke the camel's back, if there was only one more straw that needed to be put onto Carrie to break her back, these two characters put like 50 on and absolutely destroyed it. Like I feel like these two characters absolutely deserved what came to them, and Sue finding Carrie in the middle of the road after this event is very solemn. Like it's very low key in a way. The telepathy that occurs between these two characters is also absolutely perfect. It's something that wasn't able to be conveyed in the film or the TV series or there wasn't a TV series. In the film or the made for TV movie, I'm not going to count the remake because I don't remember that one very well. It's not something that was conveyed super well because telepathy is kind of hard to convey in the first place. Like you have to be very specific about how to do that to make it work. But in book form, it works perfectly. And the fact that Sue and Carrie communicate telepathically right before Carrie dies here is amazing. Like I just thought it worked super well. And then following this is kind of when part 3 happens. And part 3 is super short. In my copy, it's only like 10 pages out of all the 310 pages or so. Part 3 is only like 10 pages. So it's super short. But this conclusion achieves a very great goal of just being super depressing. Like, I graduated in 2020, and I thought that sucked. It doesn't even come close to the little bit that this book kind of discusses how solemn and depressing that graduation in 1979 in this town was. Though all joking aside, this tone that Stephen King conveys in these 10 pages is absolutely perfect. I enjoyed it so much. So here we kind of get into my final thoughts and wrap up. To be honest, I was anticipating a very mediocre book because when it comes to a lot of the people that I've seen like give out ratings for this book, I've seen tons of people throw out like 5 out of 10 or something like that, and other people throw out like 7. So I was expecting a middle of the road, mediocre, maybe even slightly bad book. I enjoyed Carrie a lot more than I anticipated. I was originally thinking that it would be like a 7 or something like that. While I was reading parts 1 and the first half of part 2, I was definitely on the side of thinking it was more like a 7.5, maybe 7.75 out of 10. And that was the way that I was experiencing for the most part, but I definitely got to say that the finale in part 2, and especially that close in part 3, so probably about like the last 75, 80 pages or something like that, at least brought my score for this book up to an 8 out of 10. So that'll definitely be how I rate Carrie by Stephen King. Like I said, it was probably leaning closer to 7.5, but this finale is phenomenal. Like, if you want to read this book just for the last 80 pages, definitely do that because it is super good. As really just the final thing that I gotta say, somehow I can't bring myself to feel like Carrie's the bad guy.